Quest for King Arthur, and I'm the King Arthur guy. This is episode 2. If you have not seen episode 1, I suggest you go back and watch it, because I'm going to be referring to a number of things in this episode that pertain to episode 1, so I'm going to need to know what I'm talking about. I want to also get a bit of housekeeping out of the way. This is not going to be an ongoing series. For reasons that will become blatantly obvious, I totally disagree with the accepted reconstruction of the history of Britain in the 5th and first part of the 6th centuries. So I'm going to spell out what I think is wrong, and I'm going to put forward my own reconstruction. And I'm just going to keep going until I run out of things to say, and then I'm going to stop. So I don't know how many episodes that's going to be. Anyway, this particular episode is going to be about the written sources, most importantly, the Ruin and Conquest of Britain by Gildas. But I'm going to start with an argument put forward by the side that says that Arthur is fictional, that says that Arthur's name is missing from other sources besides Gildas's book. And I mentioned this in the first episode, saying, no, it isn't. Well, I had to go to the King Arthur Wikipedia page to find out what they were talking about. According to that, there are two categories of sources that don't mention Arthur. The first is the Anglo-Saxon sources, of which we only have two: the Ecclesiastical History of the English People by Bede, which was written in 731, and the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which was begun in the 9th century but was continued by anonymous scribes for a number of centuries. So the question there is not why isn't Arthur's name in Anglo-Saxon sources, but rather, why would anyone think that it would be? One of the ways in which the study of history is more difficult than it first appears is that we naturally interpret things in terms that we are used to, but the past is not what we're used to. So people are taking the way we view history and projecting it back. The way we view history didn't exist in those days. It was invented in the 18th century as part of the Enlightenment. In late antiquity and the early medieval period, the way that Western Europeans wrote history was that they concentrated entirely on their own people, and they only mentioned individuals from other groups when they thought there was a compelling reason. So the Anglo-Saxons would not have mentioned Arthur unless they thought there was a reason. Now, I also said that we are an emotional animal. I think what's happening is that people are having an emotional response to Arthur. He was the great and glorious hero. Yes, but if you look at it logically, that would be all the more reason for the Anglo-Saxons not to have mentioned him. Why would they have deliberately drawn attention to an enemy hero? Okay, now I don't expect you to take my word for it. I'm going to back up what I'm saying by looking at the Ecclesiastical History of the English People by Bede, because Bede read Gildas. So I'm going to take a 90-year period, 450 to 540. And I've chosen this period because 450 was the time period in which the High King Vortigern hired the Anglo-Saxon mercenaries, okay, and then the mercenaries rebelled and invited in reinforcements. So the rebellion became an invasion. So that's when the Anglo-Saxons arrived. This is called the Adventum Saxorum. This is because the ancient Britons and medieval Welsh did not use the term Anglo-Saxon, they just called them all Saxons. Okay. Now, 540 is when Gildas wrote his book. Okay. So the Brythonic sources tell us that the Britons had 4 high kings in that time period: Vortigern, Ambrosius Aurelianus, Arthur, Melguin. Gildas did not mention Arthur, but he did mention each of the other 3. Bede read Gildas, therefore Bede knew about all 3 of them. But he only mentioned Vortigern, because Vortigern hired the mercenaries, direct connection to the Anglo-Saxons. Well, that's proof positive that he avoided mentioning Brythonic high kings that he knew about. So why would he automatically have mentioned Arthur? Now we turn to the second category of sources that don't mention Arthur, and this is described as any manuscript written between 400 and 830. Those are just odds and sods that happen to survive through random chance. With one exception, none of them mentioned any of the Brythonic high kings at all, and that one exception was talking about Melguin, which means Vortigern's not in any of these manuscripts, and neither is Ambrosius Aurelianus. So the fact that Arthur's missing from these manuscripts and the Anglo-Saxon sources is supposed to be evidence that Arthur was fictional, but if you look at it, Ambrosius Aurelianus is also missing from all of that material. Therefore, by exactly the same logic, it must be evidence that Ambrosius was fictional, except we know he was real because he was mentioned by Gildas. Then it's just Gildas, Occam's razor. The simplest explanation is not that there is something wrong with all of the sources that mention Arthur, but that there is something wrong with the one source that doesn't. Now we turn to the British history. See, the reason that they said that Arthur's name does not appear in any manuscript written between 400 and 830 is because 830 is when the British history was written, and that's the oldest source to mention Arthur. I don't know why they picked 400. You'd have to ask whoever wrote that entry. But anyway, the book is attributed to a monk named Nennius. There is a dispute as to whether or not Nennius actually wrote it, or if that was the name of a copyist that got attached to the book. I'm not going to get into that debate. I'm just going to say Nennius because it's less cumbersome than saying the author of the British history. So this is 300 years after the time period Arthur is said to have reigned. So everyone else is using chronology as the most important gauge of reliability. And they're saying, well, obviously there has to be something wrong with the Arthurian material because he came 300 years later. Maybe Arthur was fictional. Maybe he was a general, not a king. Maybe Arthur was his nickname. Whatever. Okay? They're all trying to figure out what's wrong with the Arthurian material. But there doesn't have to be anything wrong with it. First of all, what is important is not the age of the book. It's the age of the information within the book. We know that Nennius had access to accurate information because he said the wars between the Britons and the Anglo-Saxons began with 4 battles in Kent. That is corroborated by the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. Now, a certain amount of garbling up has taken place because the two sources list the battles in a slightly different order, but they are the same battles. Well, there's a roughly 370-year gap between those battles and the book, yet the information is still reliable, or at least basically reliable anyway. You can't make an issue out of a 300-year gap you can't prove exists. The only evidence we have that something is wrong is that Gildas did not mention Arthur. Well, then why can't the problem be with Gildas? But everyone says, no, can't be because Gildas is contemporary. They're oversimplifying. Under normal conditions, contemporary sources are the most reliable because the authors would have had information later authors would not have had. But we're not under normal conditions. The ancient Britons and medieval Welsh must have known whether or not they had a great king in that time period. Therefore, whatever went wrong on purpose. We're not trying to figure out who had what information. We're trying to figure out who falsified the information they had. That means the bias rule takes precedent. Everyone is biased. That would include Gildas. No one has ever really critically examined the ruin and conquest of Britain. No one until now. First of all, it's not even a history. It's a religious book that contains a history section. Well, this raises the possibility that the book was not originally considered to be historically reliable, and that it was actually preserved for religious purposes, and the idea that it's historically reliable could have been a mistake made hundreds of years later. Gildas's thesis was that Britain was being ruined and conquered as punishment from God for the sins of the Britons. He wrote the book sometime around the year 540. In 547, the Britons were hit with a plague, which did not spread to the Anglo-Saxons. These people were deeply religious. They really believed plagues were punishments from God. The plague hit the Britons, not the Anglo-Saxons. Then to their way of thinking, God must have been punishing the Britons, not the Anglo-Saxons. It would have appeared as if Britain was being ruined and conquered as punishment from God, and that Gildas was a prophet. Well, if that is true, then he could have said anything he wanted to in the history section, and the book would still have been preserved. Furthermore, why does a religious book have a history section? Everyone's acting like that Gildas just decided to include a totally unbiased account of history, and that had nothing to do with the religion. That's highly unlikely. It's far more likely he was using the religion to support, or rather the history, to support his religious thesis, in which case he probably manipulated the history to support that thesis. Now, Gildas fiercely criticized the Britons. The accepted interpretation is that he was a pious Briton who was appalled by the sinfulness of his compatriots. I'm going to make the argument that Gildas was actually a Roman bigot who considered the native Britons to be a bunch of inferior barbarians. According to the information we have, Gildas was the 4th son of the king of Altclut. We have the genealogy for that family. They were descended from an officer in the Roman army named Quintilius Clemens. They were Romans. Now, I'm not going to go through his entire historical account in this episode. I'm going to concentrate on his account of Roman Britain. And I think he had two agendas. One was the just general agenda depicting the Britons as inferior, but the other was a political agenda. In the first episode, I said I spotted propaganda. Well, I was reading a modern historian, and the historian said that Gildas's hero, Ambrosius Aurelianus, rescued the nation when he staged his coup and killed the tyrant Vortigern. That's a red flag. Anybody who seizes power illegally always claims to be rescuing the nation, because that's the only propaganda that can be used to justify an illegal seizure of power. I've seen it coming from people as diverse as Benito Mussolini and Vladimir Lenin, all of whom lied. So you can't take that at face value. Furthermore, it turns out Gildas never even said Ambrosius rescued the nation by staging a coup, because he never mentioned a coup. Modern researchers are trying to reconcile what he did say with information from independent sources, but there's no reason to believe that they can be reconciled. What Gildas actually said was the people turned to Ambrosius to rescue them from the marauding Anglo-Saxons. First of all, we only have Gildas's word for it that the Anglo-Saxons were marauding. Secondly, you can't reconcile these two things. When did the people turn to Ambrosius to rescue them? Before the coup? Then there would have been no need for a coup, as support for Vortigern melted away on its own. After the coup, then there would have been no need for the people to turn to Ambrosius because he was already High King. These things are incompatible. I argue that if you closely examine Gildas's section on Roman Britain, he set it up as a pattern of behavior that Britons would turn to Romans to rescue them. Okay, so let's get into, before we get into the actual examination, I should point out, I can't read Latin. I can only read English. So I had to read it in modern translation. And I'm very well aware of the fact that different translators can interpret passages in different ways. So I went to 3 different translations. In case you're interested, you could find all 3 of these books. They're still available. So this translation was made by Michael Winterbottom. This one by Hugh Williams. And this one by A.J. Giles. And who knows, if you're really interested, you might even find some other translations that I don't know about. Anyway, he began his history section by launching into a tirade about how historically the Britons have always been disobedient to the laws of God and man, and they've never had decent rulers. They've always been governed by tyrants. But then he said that the Romans built a mighty empire, intimidated even the warlike Parthians, and brought peace to almost the entire world. Well, I would argue that he was contrasting the two peoples. Britons are bad, Romans are good. This then leads into his version of the Roman conquest of Britain, saying that it was really easy. The Britons didn't even try and put up a fight, they just immediately surrendered. This is an introduction to an idea he would hammer away at, that the Britons were cowards who couldn't fight. But he was supposed to be criticizing the Britons for their sinfulness. Cowardice is not a sin. It's not a virtue, but it's not a sin. He then said, the Romans never stationed any soldiers in Britain. Okay. I knew that was a lie the instant I read it. I just couldn't figure out why he said it at first. It took me a while. But his explanation as to why they never stationed soldiers there makes no sense. He said that there weren't enough resources. But he also said that the Romans brought in civil administrators. There were enough resources for the civil administrators, but not for the soldiers. On top of that, simple economics. If you need to do something in one part of the country, but you don't have enough resources in that actual part of the country, then you bring in resources from somewhere else. Human beings have been doing this for thousands of years. After all, the pharaohs of ancient Egypt did not build the Great Pyramids just using the manpower and stones that were actually on the Giza Plateau. They used other resources. Okay. Besides, an imperial power conquered a place and did not leave a garrison there. Then the place would have immediately regained its independence. There would have been no Roman Britain. And the Romans built all sorts of forts all over Britain. Look at a map of England. You'll see many places that have the word Chester in their name, including the city of Chester itself, Chesterfield, Winchester, etc., etc. That is derived from the Latin word castra, and it means a fort. So every one of these Chester places is the location of a Roman fort, and it was definitely a Roman fort, because when the Britons became independent of Rome in 410, and they began building their own forts, they referred to them in their own language, Din, as in Dinarth, which is a region in Wales. So how come Gildas didn't know about these forts? They were still being used in his day. And then there's the fact that the Romans actually stationed 3 legions in Britain, one headquartered at Arborica, which is now York, one at Chester, and one at Caerleon. These places were collectively known as the cities of the legions. Now, true, in 2 cases, City of the Legion was only a nickname, but I find it very difficult to believe Gildas never heard the nickname. But in the 3rd instance, it's the real name. Caerleon means City of the Legion. And Gildas definitely heard of it because he mentioned it. So how'd they have a City of the Legion with no legions? It makes no sense. But all will be revealed, if you bear with me. His narration then reaches the account of the famous rebellion led by Queen Boudica. She is popularly known as Boadicea, but her real name was Boudica. Very popular figure in ancient British history. There's a statue of her in London, a statue of her in Colchester. There have been movies, documentaries, books, both historical and fictional. And Gildas began by calling her treacherous. Well, wouldn't she only have been treacherous to someone on the Roman side? His account of the rebellion is something to the effect that rebels massacred unarmed civilians. Then, of course, the Romans sent soldiers to put down the rebellion. When the soldiers arrived, the rebels just gave up. He taunted them at how cowardly they were for not even trying to put up a fight. But again, that's nothing like what really happened. We can skip over the next part of his book because it talks about the coming of Christianity and the heresies and so on. Although he did once again say that the Roman soldiers did not stay in Britain. That's a very important part of his account. The Romans never garrisoned troops in Britain. Okay, so his narration jumps forward from the 1st century, Boudica's rebellion, to the 4th century with the rebellion of Magnus Maximus. Now you need some context. By the 4th century, the Roman Empire was split into 2, Eastern and Western. And this was because it was just too difficult to try and maintain communications with such a vast area, given the limitations of the ancient world. So the Eastern Empire's capital was at Constantinople, which is now Istanbul, Turkey. Now, the Emperor Gratian ruled the Western Empire, and he started off well, but unfortunately he was one of those people who was corrupted by power, and he became very corrupt. So Magnus Maximus, a Roman officer in Britain, raised a rebellion. This was in 383. Maximus created his own empire, Britain, Gaul, and Spain, which he reigned over for 5 years before being defeated and killed. Maximus was generally very popular among the Britons. In the bardic material, for example, the bards were the court poets. Maximus is depicted as a great hero. Gildas attacked him as being evil, and he called the corrupt Gratian holy. He also accused Maximus of stripping Britain of all of its defenses, and this left it vulnerable to a major attack by foreign barbarians. Well, there was a major attack by other peoples, whom the Romans would have called barbarians, but that didn't come after Maximus' rebellion. That came before it. Okay. So now you need a completely different context. In the year 350, a Roman general in Gaul named Magnentius rebelled and seized control of the whole Western Roman Empire, killing the Western Roman Emperor Constans in the process. But the Eastern Empire was governed by Constans' brother, Constantine II, who wasn't going to let the murder of his brother and the loss of the Western Empire from his family slide. So this led to a 3-year civil war, which significantly weakened the Roman armies. And they never fully recovered. Britain, a far-off outpost, was especially badly hit with, there were no longer 3 legions in Britain. There was 1 legion, and it was under strength. And they were stretched rather thinly, dealing with other peoples who were raiding them, the Irish, the Picts and Atacati, both of whom lived in what are now the Highlands, the Saxons who attacked from the west. On top of that, not only were these Roman soldiers stretched thinly, they weren't even being paid on a regular basis. So they were very discontent. The whole thing came to a head in 367 in what was called the Barbarian Conspiracy, when all of these enemies of Rome gathered together and came up with a plan to attack Britain at the same time. So the Irish and Atacati attacked by sea from the west, the Saxons attacked by sea from the east, and the Picts went overland through Hadrian's Wall, but the garrison on the wall was paid off, so they just stood back and let the Picts go through. Of the Romans in Britain in that time period, some of them stood back and did nothing, some of them actually joined in the attackers, and those who tried to defend Britain were quickly overwhelmed. So the Romans sent an army under Theodosius to try and restore order. The Atacati, Picts, and Saxons were driven out. The Irish were not. This is when they established their colonies along the west. And I mentioned in the first episode that Dalriada would eventually become Scotland. This is where they got these colonies. And the rebellious Roman soldiers were punished. Okay, so it was a terrible mess. People believe that Gildas simply made a mistake. He put the barbarian conspiracy in the wrong place by accident. I think he did it on purpose, and I think it's directly connected to Ambrosius Aurelianus and Vortigern. Now, please bear with me here. Gildas, of course, called Vortigern a tyrant, but there are people who have defended Vortigern, and I'm in that camp. I don't think he was a tyrant. And one of the pieces of evidence that is used to defend Vortigern is the fact that in the 9th century, the rulers of the Welsh kingdom of Powys erected a monument boasting of their illustrious ancestors and Vortigern's names on the monument. They're not likely to have boasted about being descended from a tyrant. However, people have missed another part of that inscription, because it tells us that Vortigern married Servia, daughter of Magnus Maximus. Now, given the timing, she was almost certainly Maximus's granddaughter, but mistakes like that are not unknown in the genealogical material. I'm not worried about that. What I am worried about is the few times that this is mentioned, it's treated as a piece of trivia. But think about it for a second. Vortigern and Servia's descendants kept the memory of that marriage alive for 400 years and then carved it into stone on a public monument merely because it was a piece of trivia? How about because it was an important dynastic marriage? That would draw a direct political link between Vortigern and Magnus Maximus, giving Gildas a political motive for attacking Maximus. Now, in reality, when Maximus rebelled against Gratian, he did not leave Britain abandoned. He strengthened its defenses before embarking on his rebellion, and there's no evidence that anybody attacked Britain after Maximus's rebellion. But of course, according to Gildas, the Britons sent delegates to Rome begging for help, and they told such a pitiable story that the Romans took pity on them, and they sent an army to rescue them. And then this Roman army told the Britons that they'd have to start defending themselves and that they should build a wall in the north. See, according to Gildas, Hadrian's Wall hadn't been built yet. But then the Roman soldiers left again. And according to Gildas, because the Britons were just a leaderless mob and they didn't know what they were doing, they just built a wall out of turf, and then the Irish and the Picts came back and attacked them again. No, they didn't. That never happened. Okay, the first one may have been a mistake and Gildas put it in the wrong place. The second one, he just made up. Once again, the Britons went to the Romans asking for help. Once again, the Romans dispatched an army. This time, after defeating the attackers, the Romans built Hadrian's Wall in entirely the wrong century, and then told the Britons that they could not be bothered to keep bailing them out. They built watchtowers along the coast to watch for enemies. But see, he didn't mention the forts. He's talked about watchtowers. And the Romans gave the Britons military manuals so that they could train and learn how to fight, but then they just left again. And that's it. Gildas's narration does not actually explain how Britain became independent of the Roman Empire. It just sort of fades off into his account of independent Britain. Well, what really happened was that in the year 410, the Britons sent a letter to the Emperor Honorius asking for help. We don't know exactly what they wanted help with, because we don't have that letter. I know I said nobody attacked Britain after Maximus, but you got to remember Maximus was 388. Now we're talking about 410. There's a significant gap there. And the Britons didn't feel the need to ask for help until 410. So, now what we have is Honorius's reply, which is that he had no help to give and the Britons would have to fend for themselves. 410 was a very bad year for the Western Roman Empire. It was involved in a three-way civil war. See, Honorius was not very popular. So another Roman officer in Britain, named Constantine, had staged a rebellion and revived Magnus Maximus's empire, Britain, Gaul, and Spain. And at first, Honorius recognized that. So Constantine was recognized as a legitimate emperor. He's known as Constantine III. But then things started to unravel. A Roman officer in Spain named Geronitus staged a rebellion. The Visigoths invaded, and then Honorius decided to break his treaty with Constantine and also attack. So there's a three-way Roman civil war and a Visigothic invasion. So yeah, Honorius did not have any men to send to Britain. It's quite probable that many Britons saw this as Rome abandoning Britain, and they resented this. So Gildas presented it in a very different way. It's just that the Romans got fed up with bailing the Britons out. Now, that brings us to the end of Gildas's account of Roman Britain. It's very inaccurate, as I said, and everyone else just believes that he went from supposedly making all of these mistakes to being 100% reliable just by going from one paragraph to another. In a later episode, not the next episode, I don't know exactly when I'm going to get to it, but in a later episode, I'm going to argue he never got reliable at all. He just continued to falsify the historical record. Now, if you've gotten this far, thank you. I hope you'll subscribe, like, maybe share it with other people you think might be interested. And I hope you come back for episode number 3.